At this point in the course, we've covered models, views, and controllers. In other words, the pieces that make up the MVC in ASP.NET MVC. Though it's left out of the framework's name, there's a fourth component to the ASP.NET MVC framework that is equally as important as the others. So important, in fact, that the application simply will not function without it. This fourth component is called request routing, or routing for short. The concept of routing is simple. Inspect an incoming URL to determine which controller action it corresponds to, then pass execution off to that controller action. This is unlike many other web frameworks that simply expose the path of the web page to display as the URL. This approach does not work with the ASP.NET MVC approach, however, because it is controller actions, not web pages, that handle user requests. What's more, breaking the direct link between URLs and physical files on a server provides a much more powerful way to customize and control the URLs that your site exposes. Because URLs do not directly correspond to physical files, the routing layer needs to be told how to read incoming URLs and map them to the correct controller actions. In ASP.NET MVC, this is done when the application first starts up in the application start method in the global.asax.cs class. This method calls the register routes method, which, adhering to the separation of concerns principle, lives in a separate class called RouteConfig in the application's app start folder. Open the RouteConfig class to find the register routes method, which contains only a few lines. First, on line 14, is a call to route.ignoreRoutes, which tells the routing component to ignore any URLs that match the given pattern, and let the core ASP.NET request processing handle them instead. The next method call, the call to routes.mapRoute on line 16, is a bit more interesting. This call creates a new route named default and specifies a URL pattern that breaks the URL into 3 segments: controller, action, and ID. As you may expect, the first 2 segments correspond to the controller and the action that should be run. Then we provide some default values for the URL segments we've defined, which are used whenever that particular segment is not provided by the user. In this case, we default to the index action on the home controller and make the ID parameter completely optional using the URL parameter.optional property. The net result of all of this is a URL route that is very versatile. If you open up your browser, you can test it out with the various URLs that we've been using already. For instance, try entering the URL /auctions/index/1. The routing framework maps this to the index action on the auctions controller with the ID of 1. Even though we're not using the ID parameter just yet, it is a valid part of the route, so the routing framework works correctly. Now, since we've defined defaults for all of the segments of the route, try to guess what happens when we start removing segments. For instance, we already know what happens when we remove the end of the URL, the /1. We see the same view. But what about when we remove the /index, the segment that defines the action? The URL still works because the route provides a default value for the action when it's missing, falling back to the index action. Finally, what happens when we remove /auctions? Now the routing framework is using all of its default values. It executes the index action on the home controller, which displays the site's homepage. Throughout previous videos, I've mentioned the term default route or default URL several times. What I've been referring to is this default route that ASP.NET MVC generates for you when you first create your website. And for the most part, its flexible pattern is all you'll ever need. Despite that, I'll show you how to create even more advanced routes later on in the course in Chapter 5. For web forms developers, the concept of routing is quite different from what they're used to. In the next video, I'll show even more differences between the 2 frameworks.